What if the silent era was actually more controversial than Hollywood wants us to remember? Some pictures worried authorities so much they were banned, rejected, or cut apart before audiences could properly see them. These were not harmless little black and white movies. Some started arguments that lasted for decades. If you enjoy discovering the forgotten and controversial side of classic cinema, hit like and subscribe to the channel, because some of Hollywood's strangest stories are hidden inside films people were once forbidden to watch. Number 17. A Woman. 1915 pictured Charlie Chaplin entering a respectable home, wearing a dress, a wig, and enough confidence to convince almost everyone that he is a completely different person. Today, the situation looks like harmless silent comedy, but in 1915, even jokes involving gender disguise and marital flirtation could make movie censors uncomfortable. The story begins when Chaplin's troublemaking character encounters a young woman in a park and soon gets into a fight with an older man, without realizing that the man is her father. Later, the young woman invites Charlie home, where he suddenly discovers the identity of the man he fought earlier. With escape becoming difficult, Charlie creates an outrageous solution by disguising himself as a woman. One of the movie's funniest sequences shows him removing his famous mustache, changing clothes, adjusting his appearance, and casually returning as though nothing unusual has happened. The father fails to recognize him and even becomes interested in this mysterious new visitor. That misunderstanding turns the second half into a chain of increasingly awkward encounters. Chaplin uses facial expressions and physical movement rather than dialogue to make the joke work, proving how much silent comedy could communicate visually. Yet the subject underneath the comedy was exactly what worried some authorities. A male star convincingly adopting a female identity while another man openly flirts with him. Number 16. A Fool There Was. 1915. Long before Hollywood perfected the mysterious femme fatale, Theda Bara became one of cinema's earliest symbols of temptation. The story follows John Schuyler, a respected diplomat who possesses everything expected of a successful gentleman: a wife, a daughter, a career, and a comfortable home. Then he encounters a mysterious woman, known simply as the vampire, and the respectable life he carefully built begins falling apart. This woman is not a supernatural vampire. Instead, she controls people emotionally, drawing Schuyler deeper into an obsession he cannot seem to escape. He begins neglecting his family, damaging his professional reputation, and allowing his entire identity to revolve around her. One of the movie's most memorable ideas became associated with the famous phrase, "Kiss me, my fool," which helped shape Bara's public image and popularize the screen stereotype known as the vamp. Bara looked completely different from the sweet and innocent female stars usually promoted by early Hollywood. Her heavy makeup, dramatic costumes, confident expressions, and commanding presence suggested that she understood exactly how much power she possessed. That was part of what made audiences fascinated with her, but it was also part of what made authorities nervous. The female character does not simply wait for events to happen around her. She controls the emotional direction of the story. British censors refused the picture during the silent era because its themes of temptation, marital betrayal, and moral collapse crossed acceptable boundaries. Ironically, attempts to portray Bara's character as dangerous only made the actress more famous. The more newspapers warned audiences about the screen's mysterious vamp, the more people wanted to buy a ticket and discover why she was supposedly so shocking. If you thought silent films were always innocent family entertainment, these first two already tell a completely different story. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, what is the oldest silent film you have ever watched? Number 15. Hypocrites. 1915. Few silent filmmakers challenged respectable society as directly as Lois Weber. Instead of creating a comfortable romance or comedy, Weber built this picture around an uncomfortable question. What happens when people who constantly speak about morality are finally forced to look honestly at themselves? The film begins with a minister attempting to teach his congregation about truth, only to discover that respectable society often prefers comforting appearances to uncomfortable reality. From there, Weber moves into a series of symbolic scenes criticizing politicians, wealthy citizens, social leaders, and even religious communities. Her most famous idea involves a character representing the naked truth, portrayed by an unclothed woman photographed through soft visual effects that make her appear almost ghost-like. She walks through different situations, exposing dishonesty and hypocrisy, functioning less like an ordinary character and more like a moving piece of symbolic art. Weber clearly intended the figure as an artistic statement, But censorship officials were not necessarily interested in artistic explanations. Some authorities believed that such imagery should simply never appear on a public movie screen. Pennsylvania became one of the places where the picture encountered major censorship problems, while arguments about the production spread far beyond individual theaters. Supporters pointed out that classical paintings and sculptures had displayed similar human imagery for centuries. Opponents argued that motion pictures were different because they could reach enormous popular audiences. That debate revealed how quickly cinema had grown in cultural importance. Movies were no longer considered harmless carnival attractions, and Weber understood exactly what that meant. If films could entertain millions of people, they could also challenge those millions to examine their own hypocrisy. Number 14. The Birth of a Nation, 1915. Few silent films demonstrate cinema's enormous power and its potential danger more clearly than this one. D.W. Griffith created a massive historical spectacle about the American Civil War and Reconstruction, using filmmaking techniques that amazed audiences in 1915. Large battle scenes, dramatic close-ups, cross-cutting, huge crowds, and complex editing made the picture appear far more ambitious than most movies viewers had previously experienced. But the technical accomplishment came attached to deeply racist propaganda. Black Americans are portrayed through offensive stereotypes, while the Ku Klux Klan is presented as a heroic force supposedly protecting white society. The climax became one of silent cinema's most famous sequences, with mounted riders racing across the countryside while Griffith rapidly cuts between them and people waiting to be rescued. The editing creates excitement, but the ideology being celebrated is exactly what makes the sequence so troubling today. Black organizations, civil rights campaigners, religious leaders, and citizens protested the film almost immediately. Demonstrations took place in several cities, and officials in various locations either banned the movie or placed restrictions on screenings. Supporters defended Griffith's freedom to tell the story as he wished, while opponents argued that the picture distorted history and could strengthen racial hostility. What made the controversy especially important was the movie's enormous popularity. This was not a small political production seen by a handful of viewers. Huge audiences watched it, proving that cinema could shape the public's emotional understanding of history. People might forget a political article, but they could remember dramatic riders charging across a giant screen. Long before television or social media, filmmakers had already discovered how powerful moving images could become as propaganda. Number 13. Where Are My Children? 1916. A wealthy home, successful husband, and respectable social circle seemed to promise a comfortable life, but Lois Weber built one of the silent era's most controversial dramas underneath that perfect appearance. District Attorney Richard Walton spends his professional life dealing with legal cases involving reproductive information and medical practices that respectable society rarely discussed openly. At home, meanwhile, he believes that he and his wife have simply been unfortunate because they never had children. Slowly, Walton discovers that the truth is much more complicated. His wife and women within her social circle have been making deeply personal decisions without their husbands understanding what has happened. That revelation leads toward the emotional question contained in the movie's title. Walton's realization becomes the dramatic center of the film because the problem is no longer merely legal or theoretical. It has entered his own marriage. For audiences in 1916, the subjects involved were explosive. Birth control, reproductive choices, motherhood, marriage, medical ethics, and differences between wealthy and poor families were topics respectable commercial entertainment was normally expected to avoid. Weber did the opposite by placing them directly at the center of a mainstream feature film. Pennsylvania authorities banned the picture, while censorship battles followed it in other locations. Yet audiences remained fascinated because Weber was discussing something people knew existed but rarely heard mentioned in public. Her comparison between wealthy households and struggling families also introduced uncomfortable questions about class and access to information. Cinema had begun entering areas of life traditionally controlled by families, doctors, churches, and governments. Once those discussions appeared on a movie screen, keeping them private became far more difficult. Number 12. The Cheat, 1915. A wealthy socialite makes one reckless decision and suddenly finds herself trapped in one of the most controversial dramas of early Hollywood. Edith Hardy secretly uses charity money to cover her financial problems, believing she can replace it before anyone discovers what happened. When her plan fails, she desperately turns to wealthy ivory merchant Hishuru Tori for help. His assistance comes with conditions Edith never expected. The movie's most infamous sequence involves Tori marking Edith with a heated branding iron after she refuses his demands. Her husband later discovers what happened, leading to a tense confrontation and courtroom climax. Sesue Hayakawa's intense performance helped make him an international silent film star. But controversy followed the picture almost immediately. Japanese-American organizations protested the portrayal of Hayakawa's character, and the film was later altered so that his nationality was changed from Japanese to Burmese. More importantly for this list, the cheat was banned in the United Kingdom and was never released in Japan. For a film released in 1915, its mixture of marital secrecy, obsession, racial tension, financial deception, and the disturbing branding scene was remarkably bold. The silent era was supposedly innocent, but the cheat already looked like the kind of scandal censors desperately wanted audiences kept away from. Number 11. The Little American, 1917. Mary Pickford may have been known as America's sweetheart, but even one of the world's most beloved actresses could become politically dangerous. Here she plays Angela Moore, a young American woman whose private romantic life becomes swallowed by the much larger disaster of the First World War. The early portion resembles an ordinary melodrama about love and conflicting loyalties, but the arrival of war transforms the entire story. Angela travels toward Europe aboard a ship that becomes the target of an attack. The sinking sequence provides one of the movie's biggest spectacles as passengers panic and the vessel disappears beneath the water. After surviving and eventually reaching occupied France, Angela sees the consequences of war directly and becomes involved in helping Allied forces. As events progress, the film's strongly anti-German viewpoint becomes increasingly obvious. That political message caused serious problems in Chicago, where censors initially blocked the picture. Officials worried that such an emotional portrayal of German characters might increase wartime hostility and even contribute to public disturbances. The distributor challenged the decision and eventually gained permission to show the movie, but the dispute revealed how seriously authorities had begun treating popular cinema. Pickford's enormous celebrity made the issue especially important. Millions of viewers already loved her, so watching Angela suffer could potentially influence how those viewers felt about actual international events. Audiences came to see one of their favorite stars, but they also received a carefully constructed interpretation of the war. Silent Hollywood had discovered one of entertainment's most powerful techniques. Political messages become much easier to absorb when audiences receive them through characters they already care about. Number 10. The End of the Road, 1919. Two young women grow up receiving completely different kinds of information about adulthood, and that difference eventually shapes their lives. Mary is raised by a mother willing to discuss health, relationships, and personal responsibility openly. Vera receives almost none of the same guidance. As they become adults, Mary trains as a nurse, while Vera enters romantic situations without understanding many of the risks surrounding her. Eventually, Vera becomes involved with a wealthy and charming man, only to face serious medical consequences. The parallel storytelling gives the picture its emotional strength, because viewers are not merely being lectured. They watch two lives developing differently, based partly on the information each woman received. One of the film's most powerful stretches follows Mary through her nursing work, where subjects polite society usually avoids suddenly become impossible to ignore. Some of the medical material was remarkably direct for its time, creating immediate problems with censorship authorities. Pennsylvania banned the movie, while protests and restrictions followed screenings elsewhere. Supporters emphasized that the film had an educational purpose, which created a difficult question for censors. If controversial material was being shown to prevent suffering rather than simply attract attention, should it still be removed? That question made The End of the Road especially important. Governments were beginning to understand that cinema could become a tool for mass education, but they also wanted to control exactly what audiences were taught. The movie screen had become something more than entertainment. It was turning into a teacher capable of entering conversations that families and institutions often preferred to keep private. Number 9. Different from the Others, 1919. Imagine entering a movie theater in 1919 and watching a story that treats a relationship between two men with sympathy instead of presenting them as simple villains. That choice alone made Different from the Others extraordinary. The central character, Paul Corner, is a successful violinist whose private relationship with a younger man becomes dangerous after a blackmailer discovers his secret. German law criminalized relationships between men, giving the blackmailer enormous power. Paul initially pays him, hoping the problem will disappear, but the demands continue. Eventually, Paul decides to resist. The film makes an unusually progressive argument for its time. Much of Paul's suffering does not come from his feelings themselves, but from prejudice, public shame, restrictive law, and the people willing to exploit those conditions. Physician and reformer Magnus Hirschfeld even appears in the production, giving parts of the film a direct educational dimension. Another memorable passage examines Paul's earlier life and shows that discrimination has followed him for years. Rather than asking viewers to condemn him, the movie repeatedly encourages audiences to understand his circumstances and question the society making his existence so difficult. After censorship was restored in Germany, general exhibition became heavily restricted, and much of the original film was eventually lost or destroyed. Only surviving material allows modern audiences to understand what an extraordinary production it was. Its most radical quality was not simply its subject. It was the location of the audience's sympathy. The movie quietly suggested that perhaps society was creating the tragedy rather than the person being punished by it. Number 8. Within Our Gates. 1920, Oscar Micheaux did not politely ask audiences to reconsider the racist stories dominating American screens. He confronted them directly. The film follows Sylvia Landry, an educated black woman attempting to raise money for a struggling Southern school. Her journey north initially makes the story appear to be about education, opportunity, and romance, as she meets different people who might either help or complicate her mission. Then Micheaux reveals Sylvia's past through a powerful flashback involving racial persecution and mob violence. The sequence becomes especially important when compared with The Birth of a Nation, which had portrayed white supremacist violence as heroic only a few years earlier. Micheaux reverses that viewpoint entirely. Here, the victims receive humanity and sympathy, while the violent crowd becomes the true source of fear. Chicago censors initially rejected the movie, while the city remained tense following serious racial conflict. Authorities worried that showing such scenes could create further public unrest, while officials elsewhere requested cuts or restrictions. That reasoning produced an uncomfortable contradiction. Rather than treating injustice itself as the source of anger, authorities sometimes treated the movie depicting that injustice as the greater danger. Micheaux worked largely outside the traditional Hollywood system, which allowed him to explore experiences major studios routinely ignored. One of the most powerful parts of Within Our Gates is simply its insistence that audiences view racial terror from the victim's perspective. Ironically, the sequences censors found most uncomfortable are now among the reasons the film is considered such a vital surviving document of early Black American cinema. Number 7. Outside the Law. 1920 gangsters did not need rapid-fire dialogue or loud machine guns to make movie censors nervous. Todd Browning's silent crime drama already contained many ingredients later gangster pictures would make famous: underworld bosses, stolen jewels, betrayal, criminal loyalty, hidden identities, and characters who exist outside respectable society. Priscilla Dean plays Molly Madden, whose father wants to abandon criminal life but finds that escaping the underworld is far more difficult than expected. A ruthless gangster known as Black Mike begins manipulating events and pulls Molly back toward crime. Lon Chaney plays Black Mike while also appearing in another role, demonstrating the transformation skills that later made him one of silent cinema's most celebrated performers. After Molly becomes involved in a robbery, she goes into hiding with another criminal as police close in on them. Instead of filling this entire section with action, Browning introduces an unexpectedly domestic atmosphere. A child enters the criminals' lives, and the tough characters gradually reveal emotional sides audiences did not expect. That decision makes the people breaking the law more complicated than ordinary villains. Viewers spend time understanding their friendships, fears, arguments, and vulnerabilities. British censors nevertheless disliked the film's immersion in criminal life and rejected it during the silent period. Officials often feared that crime movies might glamorize people who broke the law, even if the story eventually punished them. Outside the Law demonstrates why those worries appeared so early. Making an outlaw fascinating could be considered dangerous, even when the filmmaker never directly told audiences to imitate anything they saw. Number 6. Irish Destiny, 1926. What happens when a silent love story becomes politically dangerous simply because it remembers a recent war from the wrong side? Irish Destiny provides one of the strongest answers. Released in 1926, to coincide with the 10th anniversary of the Easter Rising, George Dewhurst's film combines romance with the Irish War of Independence and is regarded by the Irish Film Institute as one of the most significant surviving works of Ireland's silent era. At the center is Dennis O'Hara, a young man whose peaceful life changes after the arrival of the Black and Tans in his village. Dennis becomes involved with the IRA and discovers plans for an attack on a secret meeting. Leaving his loved ones behind, he races toward Dublin to warn his comrades, only to be pursued, shot, and captured by British forces. The personal adventure unfolds against events audiences in 1926 still remembered extremely well. Perhaps the film's boldest visual decision was mixing fictional drama with genuine newsreel material. Scenes involving the Black and Tans and footage connected with the burning of Cork bring real history directly into the fictional story. That mixture made the conflict feel less like distant entertainment and more like a fresh political memory. British censors rejected Irish Destiny in April 1926. A modified version later appeared in Britain under the title An Irish Mother. That makes it an excellent #1 for this list. Nothing needed to be frightening in the traditional sense. There was no monster, shocking costume, or supernatural nightmare. The dangerous element was history itself. A silent filmmaker showed British rule and Irish resistance from an Irish nationalist perspective. And officials decided British audiences should not see the original film as submitted. Before actors could speak from the screen, politics was already powerful enough to silence an entire movie. Number 5. Hexon, 1922. Very few films from the early 1920s still look as strange as Hexon. Benjamin Christensen created something that refuses to fit into one clear category. Part historical documentary, part lecture, part fantasy, and part horror film. The production explores medieval beliefs about witchcraft, demons, religious fear, superstition, and behavior that earlier societies struggled to understand. The opening examines old drawings and models before the movie suddenly becomes far more visually outrageous. Demons appear, witches gather, strange potions are prepared, and religious authorities question frightened suspects. The famous witches' gathering remains one of the film's most memorable sequences, filled with grotesque costumes, unusual creatures, dramatic faces, and imagery that can still seem bizarre more than a century later. Yet Christensen was doing more than simply trying to frighten audiences. As the story develops, he suggests that behavior once blamed on witchcraft might sometimes have had psychological or medical explanations. That idea quietly turns the film against the certainty of the institutions that persecuted supposed witches. The truly frightening element becomes the possibility that innocent or vulnerable people suffered because society confidently misunderstood them. The combination of strange imagery and criticism of religious history brought censorship problems in several countries. Authorities objected both to what was shown and to the ideas underneath those images. A century later, the theatrical demons may no longer frighten audiences in the same way, but Hexon's warning about what can happen when fear and certainty replace understanding remains surprisingly powerful. Number 4. Nosferatu, 1922. Few movie monsters have survived as many attempts to make them disappear as Count Orlok. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu tells a story immediately recognizable as a version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. A young real estate agent named Hutter travels to the remote castle of Count Orlok to complete a property transaction. But from the moment he arrives, almost everything about his host seems unnatural. Orlok moves strangely, appears at night, and occupies a huge castle that seems nearly empty. Max Schreck's appearance makes the character completely different from the elegant vampires later popularized by Hollywood. His bald head, pointed ears, rigid movements, and long fingers make him seem less like a romantic aristocrat and more like a walking nightmare. The film's most famous moment uses something wonderfully simple: Orlok's shadow slowly climbing a wall and moving toward his victim. The movie's greatest threat, however, came from outside the screen. The production company had not legally obtained permission to adapt Stoker's novel. Florence Stoker, the author's widow, sued and won. A court eventually ordered copies of the movie destroyed. For a time, there was a genuine possibility that one of cinema's future masterpieces could disappear completely. Fortunately, prints had already circulated outside Germany, allowing Nosferatu to survive. The movie also experienced censorship trouble in Britain during its early history. Today, the irony is almost perfect. A film that courts ordered destroyed, and officials did not always want audiences watching, eventually became one of the most recognizable horror movies ever made. Count Orlok was nearly erased, but instead he became immortal. Number 3. A Woman of Paris. 1923, Charlie Chaplin made one of the boldest choices of his career when he directed a movie and barely appeared in it. Audiences expected the familiar tramp, but instead received a sophisticated romantic drama starring Edna Purviance as Marie St. Clair. She begins the story planning to escape an unhappy home with her lover Jean, only for a misunderstanding to separate them and send her life in an entirely different direction. Years later, Marie is living in Paris as the companion of wealthy bachelor Pierre Revel. Her elegant clothes, expensive surroundings, and confident behavior show how thoroughly she has reinvented herself. Then Jean unexpectedly returns, forcing Marie to reconsider a life shaped by money, independence, memory, love, and social expectations. Chaplin refuses to present any of those choices as emotionally simple. One of the movie's most celebrated visual moments shows Chaplin suggesting a passing train without actually displaying the train itself. Moving light across Marie and her surroundings gives viewers all the information they need. It is an elegant example of how mature silent filmmaking had become. But censors were far more interested in Marie's unconventional personal life than Chaplin's visual sophistication. Several censorship boards demanded changes, while the film was banned in Worcester, Massachusetts. A woman openly living as the companion of a wealthy unmarried man challenged accepted morality. More importantly, Marie was never reduced to either an innocent victim or an obvious villain, and she could be independent, vulnerable, loving, practical, and selfish at different moments. Chaplin wanted cinema to treat adults like complicated people, and some authorities were uncomfortable with exactly that. Number 2. Battleship Potemkin, 1925. Could editing itself be considered politically dangerous? Sergei Eisenstein proved that governments believed it could. Battleship Potemkin dramatizes the 1905 mutiny aboard a Russian naval vessel, where sailors are exhausted by poor conditions and brutal discipline. One famous sequence shows meat covered with maggots, while officers insist the food is acceptable, helping turn growing frustration into open rebellion. What made the film revolutionary was not simply its plot. Eisenstein uses editing almost like an emotional weapon, cutting between faces, weapons, crowds, soldiers, and small physical details to increase tension. The Odessa Steps sequence became the supreme example. Civilians flee down an enormous staircase, while soldiers advance in rigid formation, and a baby carriage begins rolling helplessly through the chaos. The sequence feels gigantic even though much of its impact comes from the arrangement of images rather than expensive spectacle. Viewers see terrified faces, marching boots, frightened parents, and the uncontrolled carriage. Eisenstein does not merely explain political oppression. He creates an emotional experience that encourages the audience to identify with the people resisting authority. British censors rejected the movie in 1926 because of concerns surrounding its revolutionary message, and the film remained restricted there for decades. Other governments also limited its exhibition. Officials understood something extremely important. A revolutionary speech could be banned, but images could inspire emotion without saying anything at all. No spoken dialogue was needed on the Odessa Steps. The editing had already made the argument. Number 1. The Seashell and the Clergyman, 1928. What kind of silent movie could confuse British censors so badly that even its meaning seemed suspicious? Germaine Duloc's The Seashell and the Clergyman provides the perfect answer. Often regarded as one of cinema's earliest major surrealist works, it abandons ordinary storytelling and throws the viewer directly into the disturbing fantasies of a clergyman obsessed with a general's wife. Instead of presenting a straightforward romance, Dulac fills the screen with fractured mirrors, distorted faces, violent gestures, dreamlike movement, disappearing objects, and constantly changing spaces. The clergyman pursues the woman through a psychological world where jealousy, authority, religion, and desire become almost impossible to separate. Images replace logic, making the movie feel closer to a nightmare than a conventional drama. That strange visual language became precisely what made the film notorious. British censors refused it, judging the work so obscure that its meaning was difficult to determine, while simultaneously suspecting that whatever meaning existed was objectionable. The censorship decision helped give the movie a reputation far larger than its short running time might suggest, and that is why it deserves the number 1 position. There was no shocking dialogue because there was no dialogue at all. There was no conventional scandal that censors could neatly explain. Instead, a female director used surreal images to question male desire, religious authority, and established power, and officials found the result threatening even when they admitted they could barely understand it. Nearly a century later, that censorship decision sounds almost unbelievable, but it perfectly proves the point of this entire list. Silent filmmakers did not need spoken words to cross the line. Sometimes confusing authority was enough to get a movie banned. These films prove that silent cinema was never as innocent as people imagine. Before Hollywood actors could speak, filmmakers were already challenging censorship, politics, prejudice, religion, war, relationships, and social rules. Some films were cut, others were banned, and a few nearly disappeared forever. Which movie surprised you most? Tell us in the comments. And if you enjoyed discovering this forgotten side of cinema history, like the video, share it, and subscribe for more stories. Classic Hollywood, almost left behind.